The drum was sealed tight. Flies circled it, the stench unbearable. But when officers pried the lid open, they didn't just find a decomposing body. They uncovered stories so chilling, it would send shockwaves through an entire nation. You're watching Crime Chronicles Confidential, where we uncover the brutal truths that governments bury. This isn't just a story. It's a truth that remained hidden for years until now. It was a quiet morning on the outskirts of Bangalore. The traffic was sparse, the air thick with early summer heat. Along a dusty roadside, near an overgrown patch of shrubs and abandoned construction debris, something out of place caught the attention of a local vendor setting up his tea stall. It was a blue plastic drum, scuffed, dented, and eerily out of place. At first glance, it seemed like another piece of urban waste. But then came the smell. A pungent, sickening stench clung to the air like invisible smoke. Passers-by began to pause, covering their noses, whispering among themselves. Within minutes, someone called the police. When the officers arrived, they approached the drum cautiously. It was tightly sealed heavy and reeked of something far worse than rotting food or chemicals. With gloved hands, one officer began to unscrew the metal ring that held the lid in place. As the seal broke, the smell intensified, an overwhelming wave of decay and death. Inside the drum was a human body, badly decomposed, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic sheets and old clothing. But this wasn't just a murder victim dumped in haste. The manner of concealment told a different story. Each layer was deliberate. Each fold was careful. Whoever did this didn't want the body to be found, at least not easily. The officers stepped back in stunned silence. This wasn't just a corpse. This was a cry for help frozen in time, a voice that had been silenced and hidden inside plastic walls. Someone had tried to bury the truth, but now it was leaking out one putrid breath at a time. The blue drum became a crime scene. Cameras flashed, barriers went up, and within hours, the news had already spread across local networks. An unidentified body found in a sealed drum on the edge of a city. But what the world didn't yet know was that this drum didn't just contain a body. It contained secrets. And those secrets were about to explode. The first and most urgent question was, who was she? The forensic team began their work immediately. The body, though decomposed, revealed enough clues to stir suspicion. She appeared to be in her late 20s or early 30s. Her build was average, her skin tone brown, her features once delicate, now distorted by time and rot. But there were no identifying items on her. No wallet, no ID, no mobile phone, not even a fragment of paper that could point to who she might have been. Her fingerprints were almost gone, burned, possibly with acid or fire. Her fingertips were charred beyond recognition, as if someone had tried to erase her identity, wipe her existence from every database. Her feet were bound with electrical wire, and bruises on her arms told of a struggle, one that she likely lost in terror and pain. There were older wounds, too, faint scars along her ribs and back. Not fresh, not from the murder itself. These were reminders of something else. A history of abuse? Prolonged violence? Someone had hurt her before, perhaps for a long time. But this time, they had finished the job. The pathologist noticed something else. Traces of sedatives in her blood, and internal injuries suggesting she had been unconscious, or at least heavily drugged, before death. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was methodical, cold, planned. The police now had a nameless corpse, no leads, and a growing sense of dread. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a calculated execution. Someone had gone to great lengths to silence this woman, to make sure she vanished without a trace. But even in death, her body was speaking. It was screaming, and the police were now listening. The drum itself became their first witness. Peeling back the grime and decay, investigators noticed something barely visible near the base. A faded sticker. It was a logo of a local plastic manufacturing company, a small-scale supplier of industrial storage containers. The factory was located in a warehouse district just outside the city. Detectives paid them a visit. The manager, surprised and shaken by the news, quickly pulled up transaction records. Blue drums of that exact size and model had been sold only a few days before the body was discovered. The sale had been made in cash. No receipt name, But CCTV footage told a different story. The security camera captured two men arriving in a rented white van. One man stayed inside the vehicle, while the other walked in, pointing at the blue drum stacked along the wall. He paid in cash, nodded, and left quickly. His face wasn't immediately familiar to the police, but the van's license plate was clear. The rental company provided the records. The vehicle had been leased to a man named Rajkumar V. Rajkumar was no stranger to the system. He had been questioned before in minor fraud cases, but nothing violent. A smooth talker, a drifter, someone who knew how to stay just beneath the radar. But now his name had surfaced at the heart of a murder investigation. Detectives dug deeper. Where had Rajkumar been over the past week? Who was the man with him at the warehouse? And why had he needed a plastic drum big enough to hide a body? This was no longer just about identifying a victim. The hunt for a killer had begun, and the trail, faint in plastic wrap, was now leading somewhere far darker. The name Rajkumar V opened doors to a maze of identities. When police began looking into his background, nothing was consistent. His address history stretched across multiple cities. His phone numbers kept changing. Every digital trail ended in a dead end. But slowly, a pattern emerged. Rajkumar had a habit of becoming whoever he needed to be. To some, he was a transporter, quiet, reliable, no questions asked. To others, a fake insurance agent running schemes that skimmed thousands from unsuspecting clients. And in the shadows, whispers suggested he had once been hired muscle, a man paid to make problems disappear. He was a ghost with many faces. But one face finally caught the detective's attention. In a photo from 3 years ago, taken at a small family function in Chennai, Rajkumar appeared, smiling casual, standing next to a man named Ganesh, a respected textile business owner. Calm, private, married to Sakuntala, the woman in the drum. The connection snapped into place like a bolt of lightning. Rajkumar wasn't just a random criminal. He was a friend. No, an inner circle confidant of the victim's husband. The same man who had never reported his wife missing. The same man who had claimed she had simply gone away for a few days. The investigation now turned inward. Had Ganesh hired Rajkumar? Was this murder a favor or a transaction? The blue drum, the sedatives, the clean disposal. None of it looked like a crime of rage. It looked rehearsed, precise. And in the middle of it all stood Rajkumar, a man with many names and one deadly connection. Sakuntala had once lived a quiet, invisible life. She was the kind of woman neighbors nodded to but didn't really know. She worked a desk job at a small accounting firm, took the same bus every day, and rarely spoke more than a few words to anyone outside her home. Her world was small, structured, and private. Then one day, she vanished. She didn't show up for work. No emails, no phone calls. Her boss tried reaching her, but the phone rang unanswered. By the third day, the office contacted her emergency contact, her husband, Ganesh. His response was cold, mechanical. He claimed she was visiting family and had left her phone behind. It didn't sit right with anyone. Not her colleagues, not her landlord, and certainly not the police. When authorities finally began digging, they were stunned to learn that Ganesh had never filed a missing person report, not even a formal inquiry. He had simply moved on, as if his wife's disappearance didn't warrant concern. When questioned, he brushed it off, said she had been depressed, that she needed space. But Sakuntala's friends painted a different picture. She had never spoken of leaving. She had no close family left to visit. And days before her disappearance, she had shown up at work with visible bruises on her wrists, silent, withdrawn. That silence now screamed volumes. The more the police questioned Ganesh, the more uneasy they felt. His answers were scripted, his tone distant. There were no signs of a break-in, no farewell notes, no luggage missing from the apartment. It was as if Sakuntala had simply evaporated into thin air. But people don't just disappear. They are erased. And someone, it seemed, had gone to great lengths to make sure Sakuntala was forgotten. From the outside, Ganesh appeared composed, even gentle. He spoke softly, chose his words with care, and never raised his voice in public. But behind closed doors, that calm exterior masked something far more disturbing. Ganesh was not a violent man in the traditional sense. He didn't throw punches in the street or shout at strangers. His violence was calculated, psychological, and methodical. He controlled Sakuntala in quiet, insidious ways. By isolating her, monitoring her movements, limiting her contact with friends, and making her feel that every decision she made had to pass through him first. Neighbors described Sakuntala as increasingly withdrawn in the final months of her life. She stopped attending community events, avoided phone conversations in public, and often looked anxious when returning home. One neighbor recalled hearing muffled arguments at night. Another remembered seeing her flinch when someone raised their voice nearby. Former colleagues said she once confided that her husband checked her phone every night, demanded her passwords, and accused her of imagined affairs. She would brush it off with nervous laughter, but the weight in her eyes told a deeper story. The truth became even harder to ignore when investigators found testimony from a domestic worker who had been employed in their home briefly. The woman said she saw bruises on Sakuntala's arms, once even a cut above her eyebrow. When asked what happened, Sakuntala had quietly replied, "It was my fault. I made a mistake with dinner." Ganesh never filed a missing report because he never believed anyone would question him. He thought she was invisible to the world, just another housewife with no voice, no defenders. He had trained her, over years, to believe she had nowhere else to go. But now, in death, she was finally being heard. And the man who had controlled her every move was starting to lose control of the narrative. When forensic officers removed Sakuntala's body from the blue drum, they found something else tucked beneath the final layer of plastic, an old handkerchief, stained but intact. It seemed like an afterthought, something meant to pad the body, or perhaps left there by accident. But the detail that caught everyone's attention was the embroidered logo stitched into one corner. It belonged to a small garments company, one that manufactured uniforms and wholesale textile items. Police traced the logo, cross-referenced it with local businesses, and confirmed the match. The company was registered under one name, Ganesh, Sakuntala's husband. When confronted, Ganesh claimed he hadn't seen that particular handkerchief in years. He said their stock changed all the time, that it could have been stolen, misplaced, or reused by someone else. His answers were vague, almost rehearsed. But technology had no patience for lies. Investigators secured CCTV footage from the factory premises. While most of the angles showed little, one grainy clip from a security camera installed behind the warehouse loading dock showed Ganesh himself arriving late at night 2 weeks before Sakuntala's disappearance. He wasn't alone. Alongside him was Rajkumar. The two men loaded a large plastic drum, identical to the one discovered, into the back of a white van. No words, no witnesses, just a silent exchange between two men and a container that would later become a national headline. Ganesh had told police he hadn't seen Rajkumar in months. He claimed they hadn't spoken. The footage proved otherwise. The handkerchief had betrayed him, a forgotten thread of fabric that connected the body to the business, the lie to the truth. The drum hadn't just held the body. It had held the evidence that would begin to unravel everything. The breakthrough came from a single frame. Among the hundreds of hours of footage collected from nearby industrial zones, one video stood out. It showed a dimly lit alley behind the garment factory, where Ganesh operated. The timestamp was just days before Sakuntala was reported missing. In the grainy footage, two men were seen struggling to lift a large blue drum into the back of a white van. The camera angle was poor, the lighting weak, and their faces blurred. But the shape of the drum, its distinctive scratches and faded sticker, was unmistakable. It was the same drum found on the roadside, the drum that held Sakuntala. But there was something else, clearer than the figures themselves. As the van reversed into the frame, the license plate caught a perfect sliver of light. It was fully visible, and it matched a vehicle registered not to Ganesh, but to one of his oldest friends, Rajkumar, the same Rajkumar who had rented the van, the same man whose name kept surfacing like a stain that wouldn't wash away. The link was undeniable now. The husband, the friend, the drum, and the van, they were all part of the same tightly wound conspiracy. Police pulled phone records, financial transactions, digital footprints. Ganesh had lied about his connection to Rajkumar, about his wife's disappearance, about the drum, the factory, and everything in between. The CCTV didn't just capture movement, it captured intent. And as blurry as the faces were, the truth had never looked clearer. The footage was grainy, taken from an old surveillance camera positioned across the road from a storage facility. But despite the poor resolution, one detail was unmistakable. A large blue drum being lifted into the back of a white van by two men under the cover of night. Their faces were partially obscured. One wore a cap, the other kept his head down, but the movement was clear, practiced, and deliberate. Most crucially, the van's license plate was perfectly visible. When police traced the registration, it didn't lead to Rajkumar or Ganesh directly. Instead, it was under the name of a lesser-known associate, an employee at Ganesh's factory who had recently resigned without explanation. That man, too, was a close friend of Rajkumar's and had no prior criminal record. But now, his name was on the books, and the pressure was on. The police brought him in first. Hours of interrogation broke down his carefully maintained silence. Eventually, he cracked. Not in a dramatic outburst, but in quiet, fragmented sentences that confirmed what investigators feared. He admitted that Rajkumar had approached him with a job. Just transportation, no questions asked. But when the body was discovered, guilt became fear and fear became confession. Rajkumar was arrested next. He denied everything at first, claimed he was being framed. But after 3 days of relentless questioning, he broke too. The story spilled out. Sakuntala had been poisoned, not beaten or strangled. A slow-acting sedative mixed with a heavy dose of toxic compound slipped into her food. She had collapsed at home, unconscious. Ganesh didn't panic. He had prepared for this. Her body was stored in an industrial freezer, kept hidden for days while the plan came together. The drum was purchased. The materials were gathered. Rajkumar was paid in cash to assist. And then, on a quiet night, they moved her, wrapped, sealed, and packed like inventory, dumped her body on the edge of the city, and walked away. To them, it was clean, efficient, untraceable. But lies unravel. And cameras, no matter how silent, always remember. The question that haunted everyone was simple, yet deeply unsettling. Why? Why would a man murder his own wife with such cold precision? Why would he go to such lengths to erase her from existence? The answer was buried not in passion, but in possession. Sakuntala had recently filed for a division of property. After years of enduring control, surveillance, and emotional suffocation, she had taken a quiet but firm stand. She wanted out. She wanted her share of what she had helped build, both emotionally and financially. That request shattered something deep within Ganesh. Not his heart, but his ego. He saw her not as a partner, but as an extension of his identity. Something he owned, something he controlled. The moment she tried to reclaim her autonomy, she became a threat. And in Ganesh's mind, threats weren't to be negotiated with. They were to be eliminated. There were no heated arguments. No final confrontation. He didn't try to stop her legally or emotionally. He simply decided that if he couldn't control her in life, he would control the narrative of her death. It was about more than property. It was about male ego, sharp, toxic, and centuries old. It was the ancient belief that a woman's independence is dangerous, that her refusal to obey is shameful, and that her resistance deserves punishment. Sakuntala wasn't just murdered. She was silenced by a man who couldn't tolerate the sound of her voice anymore. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer the timeline became. This wasn't a moment of rage or a sudden lapse in judgment. It was a premeditated act, calculated down to the smallest detail. Ganesh had begun his preparations weeks in advance. He researched sedatives online, using incognito browsers and burner phones to avoid detection. He made multiple visits to local pharmacies under different names, claiming prescriptions for imaginary relatives. Eventually, he acquired a toxic compound, slow-acting, tasteless, nearly undetectable if administered in small doses. The blue plastic drum had been purchased 10 days before Sakuntala's death. Surveillance footage from the factory confirmed it was Ganesh and Rajkumar who had picked it up. The payment was made in cash. The receipts were never kept. They chose a drum large enough to conceal a human body, but common enough to avoid suspicion. The freezer was the next piece of the puzzle. Police discovered that a second-hand commercial freezer had been bought and delivered to a locked storeroom at Ganesh's factory, where security access was limited to only him and Rajkumar. The delivery record, signed under a fake name, matched the timeline of Sakuntala's disappearance. On the night of the murder, Ganesh prepared her favorite dish. He mixed in the poison. Within hours, she collapsed. There was no struggle, no panic. He wrapped her body in bedsheets, sealed it in plastic, and placed it in the freezer. She remained there for nearly 4 days. Once rigor mortis passed and decomposition began, they moved her to the drum. More plastic, more sealing. No leaks, no smell. It was done clinically, without hesitation. The van was rented under the name of a trusted associate. The route was chosen carefully, avoiding toll roads and traffic cameras. They drove in the dead of night, dumped the drum on an isolated roadside, and left without a trace. But what Ganesh failed to anticipate was the relentlessness of the evidence. Every camera, every receipt, every digital footprint told a piece of the story. And together, they proved what was once only a suspicion. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It was a blueprint for murder, carefully drawn, brutally executed. In the courtroom, Ganesh sat in silence, dressed in white, hands folded, face carefully composed. His lawyers painted him as a victim of circumstance, a grieving husband wrongly accused, a man shattered by his wife's sudden disappearance. He spoke softly, sometimes wiping his eyes, claiming he had no knowledge of what had happened to Sakuntala. But the prosecution came armed with more than emotion. They brought facts, CCTV footage, purchase records, witness testimonies, rental agreements, medical reports, phone logs. Every detail lined up. Every lie he had told unraveled in front of him. The jury watched as the timeline was reconstructed minute by minute, showing how he had planned, executed, and tried to bury the crime. Rajkumar testified under a plea deal. He described the role he played, the money he was promised, the instructions he followed. And at the center of it all stood Ganesh, not as a grieving husband, but as an orchestrator of death. The defense tried to shift blame, claiming coercion, mental instability, marital strain. But the truth had already pierced the room. There was no accident here, no breakdown, just a man who believed he could control everything, even the outcome of a murder. In the final hearing, the judge's words echoed through the hall. "This case," he said, "is not just about a murder. It is a mirror held up to our society. It shows the invisible chains women still live with, where silence is survival and resistance is punished with death." Ganesh was sentenced to life imprisonment. But for many watching, the case felt bigger than a verdict. It was a reckoning, an exposure of what lies beneath the surface of so-called ordinary homes. And in that courtroom, for the first time, Sakuntala's voice, buried for so long, was finally heard. After the camera stopped rolling and the courtroom emptied, the real weight of the case lived on, in the voices that refused to go silent. Sakuntala's mother, an elderly woman with trembling hands and eyes that had seen too much, visited her daughter's grave every morning. She brought fresh flowers. She whispered prayers. She sat for hours in silence, as if waiting for answers that would never come. Her grief was quiet but endless, a ritual of remembrance in a world that had moved on too quickly. Her younger sister, by contrast, was fire. In court, she had stood up during the final hearing, unable to contain her rage. Her voice cracked as she shouted, "My sister did nothing wrong. She only wanted to live, to breathe, to be free." That cry wasn't scripted. It wasn't planned, but it shook the room. These two women, one broken, one burning, became the emotional spine of the case. Their pain made the public listen. Their persistence made the press return. They gave Sakuntala the dignity she had been denied in life, the dignity of being seen, being mourned, being remembered. Their testimonies weren't just statements. They were acts of resistance. They reminded the world that Sakuntala was not just a body in a drum. She was a daughter, a sister, a woman who dared to want more. And though her voice had been taken from her, There's rows louder than ever. They refuse to let her be another statistic. They turn a tragedy into a reckoning. The blue drum now sits in a locked evidence room, sealed and marked, its contents long removed, but its presence still heavy. To the court, it's just an exhibit. But to those who follow the case, it has become something else entirely. A symbol of silence, of secrets, of the violence that hides behind everyday walls. It doesn't make a sound, but it speaks volumes. About a woman no one looked for. About a crime planned in the quiet of a home. About a society that teaches women to stay silent, and men to believe they can get away with anything. Layer by layer, the drum had been wrapped to hide what lay within. But truth has a way of leaking through, even when buried in plastic and lies. You can suppress a voice, erase fingerprints, hide a body, but not forever. The drum was never meant to be found, but it was. And now, it stands as a witness, cold, quiet, unmovable, against the illusion that silence can protect the guilty. Truth always finds a way out. Did Sakuntala get justice? Perhaps. Her killer was sentenced. The truth was exposed. The headlines were written. But justice is more than a verdict. It's a reckoning with the system that allowed her to be silenced for so long. For every Sakuntala who is found, how many remain hidden? How many voices are still trapped, wrapped in fear, sealed in silence, discarded like waste? How many women vanish behind closed doors? And how many families are told to keep quiet, to protect reputations, to move on? The blue drum may be closed, the case may be filed, but the story isn't over. Because justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about listening to the unheard, seeing the invisible, and asking the questions that make us uncomfortable. How many Sakuntalas are still waiting to be found? And will we hear them before it's too late? If this story moved you, like the video, subscribe, and continue this journey of real, untold stories with Crime Chronicles Confidential. Because some truths aren't spoken, they're only heard. Buried but still alive.